It happened in front of everyone. I was standing at the back of the banquet hall at Sloane's company anniversary party, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching the room glow with pride I had helped build. Investors in pressed suits. Department heads I had personally hired. People whose job offers I had written, whose vendor accounts I had set up, whose orientation I had designed from scratch. The catering company was one I had vetted 2 years earlier. Even the playlist had been pulled from a document I made. And then Sloane lifted her champagne glass, smiled her best smile, and said that real success had a funny way of making jealous people show themselves. The room chuckled. A few people nodded. Then she turned her head, looked straight at me across the crowd, and said that some people confused support work for leadership because they simply couldn't handle watching someone else shine. The laughter shifted. Quieter. Sharper. More pointed. I stood there with my chest locked tight, still trying to breathe through the shock, when a man near the back of the hall, one of the visiting executives, set his drink down on a table and asked, very calmly, who had actually built the company's operating system. My name is Avery Bennett. I was 30 years old when that question saved my life. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way movies show someone being rescued at the last second. It saved it quietly, the way a single window of light saves a dark room. For 3 years before that party, I had been the person holding the company together from the inside. Not the face, not the name people recognized, not the one with the beautiful quotes in local business features. I was the one who showed up before everyone else and left after everyone else. I built the vendor structure from nothing, every contract, every backup supplier, every rate negotiation. I designed the hiring process, wrote the job descriptions, created the onboarding folders, built the training schedules. I mapped out the warehouse flow and fixed it twice when it stopped working. I made the payroll system and then corrected it when the payroll company made errors. I drew up the customer service escalation map so that no complaint ever reached Sloane without a solution already attached. I was the architecture nobody photographed. My younger sister, Sloane, was magnetic and fearless and easy to love from a distance. I was the reason the whole structure didn't fall when she wasn't watching. 3 years before that party, Sloane showed up at my apartment at 9 in the evening with red eyes and a voice I barely recognized. She sat on my kitchen floor, not even on the chair I offered, and talked for nearly 2 hours about an idea she had been carrying for months. A boutique logistics and fulfillment company serving small business owners who couldn't afford the big platforms. She had the vision, the personality, the connections, and the nerve. What she didn't have was someone who could make it real. Then she looked at me in a way she hadn't since we were children sharing a bedroom and said I was the only person she trusted to build something that would last. She promised we would be equal. Once the company found its footing, everything would be made official. She would get the name on the front because that was where her skills lived, and I would get everything that mattered underneath. I believed her. She was my sister. We had grown up in a house where our parents said, half jokingly, that together we made one perfect person, Sloane's charm and Avery's brain. I quit my job at a supply chain firm, emptied most of my savings, and went all in. The first year was brutal and beautiful at the same time. We worked out of a rented co-working space, then out of a small warehouse unit on the edge of the city. I slept 4 or 5 hours most nights. I spent weekends building spreadsheet models, rewriting vendor terms, troubleshooting shipping software that kept crashing. Sloane spent those same weekends meeting people, attending events, pitching to potential clients with a warmth and energy that was genuinely hard to replicate. She was extraordinary at it. She could walk into a room knowing nobody and leave with 3 business cards and a follow-up lunch. I don't say that with bitterness. She had a real gift. The problem wasn't what she was good at. The problem was what happened over time to what I was good at. In the beginning, she introduced me as her partner at every meeting, every pitch, every dinner. I sat beside her and explained the operational side while she explained the vision. People nodded at both of us. Then something shifted. Partner became the right hand. The right hand became support staff. Support staff became her sister who helps with the back end. And every time I felt the change, she would touch my arm and say she couldn't do it without me. I kept believing that was enough. The first real crack showed up during a lender presentation in the spring of our second year. We were sitting in a glass-walled conference room at a bank downtown, and Sloane was presenting a growth strategy to 3 people who controlled our next round of financing. I sat at the table beside her and listened while she walked through a plan I had spent 6 sleepless weeks building. She used my projections. She used my phrasing. She even used an analogy I had worked out on a notepad at midnight, something about a river needing both a strong current and a solid bank to be useful. I waited for her to say my name. She never did. When the meeting ended and we were alone in the elevator, I told her she had presented my work without crediting me. She laughed in a way that wasn't unkind, exactly, but wasn't kind either. She said we win and lose together, so credit shouldn't matter between families. She told me I was being sensitive. I let it go. But in the next presentation, she did it more easily. And the time after that, she didn't even pause. The theft had become natural. She had stopped noticing she was doing it because I had stopped pushing back. I went to my parents that summer. I still believed my family corrected what ambition could distort. My father listened to me for about 10 minutes and then said Sloane had what it takes to lead because she understood people, and I was better with the details. He said it kindly, like it was a compliment. My mother said I should feel proud that my sister trusted me enough to lean on me. By the end of dinner, I had somehow been made to feel ashamed for wanting acknowledgement. Sloane sat across from me that whole evening looking quiet and patient, like a person being wrongly accused and choosing grace instead of anger. She looked wounded in a way that made everyone else look at me like I was the one causing pain. I drove home that night understanding something cold and important. If I ever had to fight for what was mine, my parents would not be standing beside me. They had already chosen their version of the story. In their version, Sloane shone and I supported. That was the natural order, not unfair, just accurate. I had spent 30 years being called reliable, and I didn't understand until that night that in my family, reliable had always meant something close to disposable. 3 weeks after that dinner, I found a packet of papers in the office printer tray. They had been left there by mistake, the kind of small, careless accident that changes everything. I picked them up thinking they were vendor invoices or shipping summaries. They weren't. They were draft legal documents connected to a company restructuring plan. My hands started shaking before I reached the second page. The documents had my name in them, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't listed as co-founder or partner or operational lead. I was listed as a consultant. A paid contractor with a defined exit clause and no equity stake. The restructuring had been designed to quietly move me from the foundation of the company to the edge of it, and then off it entirely. The date on the draft was 4 months old. 4 months. While Sloane was still calling me her partner at events and squeezing my arm in front of clients, she had already been meeting with lawyers, designing the cleanest way to remove me without a fight. I stood at that printer for a long time. Then I made 2 copies of every page, hid them in my bag, replaced the originals in the tray, and walked back to my desk. I didn't say a word. I confronted Sloane the next morning in her office with the door closed. I had rehearsed staying calm and I managed it, mostly. I told her I had seen the documents. I asked her to explain. I expected her to deny it first, then apologize, then make promises. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression that wasn't cruel, exactly, but was entirely settled. Like she had prepared for this conversation and was relieved to finally be having it. She said the company had grown past what she called our little family arrangement. She said investors needed structure and structure required clarity, and my role had always been clearest when I was solving problems quietly. She slid a printed offer across the desk, a buyout number that was small enough to be offensive and polished enough to sound reasonable if anyone else read it. She told me that if I really loved her, I wouldn't make this ugly. I stared at the number. I stared at her face. Then I picked up my bag, stood up from the chair, and walked out of the room before she could see that my hands were shaking so badly I had to hold them against my sides the whole way down the hall. The buyout offer had an attachment. A non-disparagement agreement. 4 pages of legal language that basically meant I could leave quietly or I could leave loudly and spend money fighting it in court. The number they offered was not nothing, but it was the kind of number that said we know you won't fight us, not the kind that said we know what you're worth. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time, reading every page twice, trying to figure out whether the pain of walking away was worse than the cost of staying. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed. A text from one of the warehouse supervisors, sent to me by mistake, clearly meant for someone else. It asked if it was true that I was stepping down because I couldn't handle Sloane's success. That was how I found out she was already rewriting the story before I had even answered her offer. She hadn't waited to see what I would do. She was already building a version of me that the company would remember when I was gone. Sad, unstable, overwhelmed by someone else's greatness. I put the buyout papers in the glove compartment, drove home, and called my lawyer. Her name was Dana Whitmore. A friend of a friend had mentioned her once over dinner, saying she was the kind of attorney who didn't speak in comfort and didn't waste time. That turned out to be exactly right. Dana read everything I brought her, the documents from the printer, the original text messages from when Sloane first asked for my help, the photos I had taken of early planning notes, the email thread showing my involvement in every major system. She asked me sharp questions for over an hour. What could be proven by dates? What did I have in writing? Who had witnessed Sloane crediting my work as her own? Were there contractors or consultants who had specifically worked with me rather than Sloane? At the end of the meeting she said what happened to me was ugly, and ugly didn't always mean untouchable. She said if we were careful, patient, and factual, Sloane's own paper trail might be enough to expose the truth without us needing to be aggressive. For the first time in weeks, the sick, spinning feeling in my chest began to settle into something harder. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the feeling of having a plan. The next morning, my company email stopped working. I assumed it was a system glitch and drove in early to sort it out. My keycard didn't open the parking gate. I parked on the street and walked to the front entrance. The door wouldn't respond to my badge. I pressed the buzzer. The receptionist, a woman named Paula, who I had personally interviewed and hired 18 months earlier, came to the glass and told me she had been given instructions not to let me in. Her eyes stayed near my shoulder the whole time, never quite reaching my face. I stood in that lobby for a moment, looking at the place I had built from the inside, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Grief. Every wall, every system, every process behind those doors had my fingerprints on it. The inventory software had been my choice. The break room scheduling board had been my idea. The emergency contact protocol posted beside every exit was something I had written at 2 in the morning after a warehouse incident scared me badly. And now I was on the wrong side of the glass, and the receptionist I had hired wouldn't meet my eyes. 2 days later, Elise Turner asked me to meet her for coffee. Elise had been one of my best managers. Not flashy, not political, just steady and sharp. She arrived before me and already had her coffee in both hands when I got to the table. She didn't waste time on small talk. She told me that everyone on the inside understood the real story. That people talked. That no one with actual knowledge of operations believed Sloane had built those systems alone. Then she put a notebook on the table and slid it toward me. She had been writing things down for almost a year, she said. Dates. Meetings. Moments where Sloane had stood in front of the team and taken credit for processes she had nothing to do with designing. Briefings where Sloane explained procedures she had clearly just read for the first time that morning. Notes from consultant calls where my name had been used as the main point of contact, then quietly removed from records afterward. The notebook was 60 pages. I sat across from Elise and felt something I hadn't felt in months. I was not invisible. I was not imagining things. There were witnesses. There were notes. There was someone who had been quietly, steadily watching the truth the whole time. Less than 2 weeks after I was locked out, the company started cracking. I heard it first through Elise, then through 2 former colleagues who still texted me. Vendor invoices were being approved twice because nobody understood the double-check system I had built into the approval workflow. A payroll error hit 34 employees in the same week, salaries either underpaid or dated wrong, because the person who had taken over my role didn't know about the manual correction step that the software required on the second Friday of each month. Shipping delays backed up badly because the backup routing rules I had written into the system were being quietly overridden by someone who thought they were simplifying things. Clients who had been managed through an escalation process I designed started getting dropped from follow-up cycles because nobody knew the process existed. Sloane responded the way she always responded to trouble. She smiled more, spoke louder, blamed the growing pains of a scaling company, and held a morale event in the warehouse with catered food. But there were numbers attached to these problems now. Real numbers. Losses and missed deadlines and clients who called in frustrated. Charm covered a lot of things. It did not cover a payroll error that hit 34 employees at once. One rainy Thursday evening, Sloane knocked on my apartment door. I hadn't spoken to her since I walked out of her office. I stood in the hallway and looked at her through the gap, and for a second felt the pull of the old reflex, being her sister, the person who fixed things. She was wearing a soft grey coat. Her eyes were bright in the way they got when she needed something. She said the company was going through a fragile period and asked if I would come back quietly for a few weeks until things stabilized. We could sort out the rest later. Her voice was the same voice she had used in my kitchen 3 years ago, sitting on the floor, saying I was the only one she trusted. I listened to every word. Then she asked me to keep it quiet so investors wouldn't worry about instability. That one detail told me everything. She didn't want me back because she was sorry. She wanted me back because she was afraid, and she needed it to happen in a way that kept her looking fine. She wanted me to save her while still pretending she hadn't needed saving. I told her to put every request in writing and closed the door. Dana called me the next morning with news I hadn't expected. The executive who had asked the question at the anniversary party, the man who set down his drink and cut through the whole room with one calm sentence, had a name. Graham Hale. He was the CEO of a national company 3 times the size of Sloane's, and he had attended the party because his team was evaluating Sloane's business as a potential acquisition target. His company wanted to expand into regional fulfillment and distribution. Sloane's operation, on paper, looked like a good fit. But Graham Hale wasn't the kind of person who bought a company based on what it looked like on paper. He cared about infrastructure. He cared about systems that could survive pressure and scale without breaking. He cared about whether the people who built those systems were still there, still invested, still the ones who would run them. In other words, he was asking exactly the right question. Dana said his team had quietly reached out through professional channels asking if I would be willing to provide operational background on the company. I read that phrase twice. Operational background. It was a formal way of saying they already suspected the truth and wanted to hear it from me directly. The meeting with Graham Hale was in a small conference room at a neutral office building downtown. No audience, no cameras, no dramatic setup. Just a round table, 4 chairs, 2 of his people, and him. Graham was in his early 50s, with a steady, unhurried way of speaking that made you feel like he was giving every sentence exactly the weight it deserved. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he didn't uncap for the first 10 minutes, which told me he was listening before he was writing. Then he started asking questions. Not general questions about my role or my history. Specific, technical, operational questions that only someone who had actually built those systems could answer without pausing. He asked about the vendor contingency logic, what triggered a backup supplier activation and how that decision was documented. He asked about the staffing ratio model and what the buffer rules were. He asked about the escalation protocol and why certain customer complaint categories were prioritized differently. I answered every question without hesitating. Halfway through, he stopped uncapping his pen and just watched me. When the meeting ended, he thanked me in a tone that felt heavier than politeness. I don't know who told her, but Sloane found out about the meeting within 48 hours. My father called first. His voice was tight with disappointment, the same tone he used when I was 16 and had embarrassed the family. He said I was going out of my way to damage my sister's future and that a woman with my intelligence should know better. My mother called an hour later, crying softly, saying I was humiliating Sloane in front of powerful people. Then Sloane herself left a voice message. Controlled at first, then starting to shake. She said that if I ruined the best opportunity of her life, I would prove every person right who had ever doubted me. What stayed with me wasn't the anger in her message. It was the speed. Within 2 days, she had turned my parents into people repeating her version of events. She didn't just lie. She organized people around her lie. She handed them a story that felt true because it matched what they already wanted to believe about us. Sloane was the star, I was the support, and they carried it without ever calling me. That was the part that showed me how long this had actually been happening. Not weeks. Not months. Years. Dana's team spent 2 weeks going through every document they could access legally. Early company records, consultant summaries, email chains from the first year, budget drafts, planning decks. What they found wasn't one big piece of obvious proof. It was dozens of small pieces that, together, created a picture impossible to argue with. In the earliest planning documents, before Sloane had locked in my commitment to leave my job and pour my savings in, she had referred to me as co-founder in at least 7 different places. There were draft pitch decks with my initials on the system's architecture page. Onboarding files that referenced templates I had built by name, with my version history still attached. Consultant notes from the first 8 months that described me specifically as the operational architect of the company. None of it was loud. None of it was a signed contract that said Avery Bennett owns half of this company. But it showed a clear and consistent pattern, that Sloane had presented our work as a shared project when she needed my effort and energy, and then quietly restructured my identity once that effort had produced something worth keeping. Dana called it the most thorough quiet erasure she had seen in a professional dispute in years. The second settlement offer came through lawyers. I was in Dana's office when the document arrived, and I watched her read through it across the desk with a stillness that meant she was finding something interesting. Then she turned it around and let me read it. The number was 10 times higher than the first. It was wrapped in careful language about mutual privacy, family dignity, and protecting the company's public reputation during a critical growth period. Dana didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me. I read the number again and then I understood what she was seeing. The first offer had been Sloane being arrogant. She thought I was tired and overwhelmed and would take a reasonable-sounding exit to make the pain stop. This second offer was something different. This was Sloane being afraid. The truth had moved out of my memory and into documentation, and she knew it. A signed, witnessed, dated paper trail of her own creation was working against her, and no amount of smiling or crying was going to dissolve it. I turned down the second offer on the same day it arrived. Dana nodded like she had expected that. She told me to get some rest and be ready for the next move because it was coming. The next move was personal. Sloane found Luke Mercer, my ex-fiancé. We had ended things 14 months earlier, not with one big fight but with the slow understanding that I had poured so much of myself into the company that there wasn't enough left for a relationship. Luke had watched it happen. He knew how much I worked, how invisible I had become inside something I helped create. When he called out of nowhere, his voice was kind in a way that made it worse. He said maybe I needed to ask whether this fight was about the company or about not being able to stand watching Sloane succeed. He said those words carefully, like he wasn't sure they were true but was repeating them anyway. I sat on my couch after the call and cried harder than I had at any point since the party. Not because he was right, he wasn't, but because he had once known me well enough to know exactly where to press. When I stopped crying, I noticed something. The grief was real. But underneath it, something had gone very quiet and very solid. Like a door closing softly from the inside. Graham Hale scheduled a final review meeting. Dana told me about it through careful, measured language. It was a formal session, investors, legal representatives, key senior managers, and a small advisory group from Graham's company all in the same room. Sloane didn't know I had been asked to attend as well. I arrived early and sat near the back. When Sloane walked in, she looked extraordinary. She was wearing a dark blue suit and her hair was pulled back cleanly. She scanned the room with easy confidence and found her seat at the front with the practiced calm of someone who had spent 3 years performing certainty. For the first 30 minutes, she was brilliant. She spoke about vision, growth, operational maturity, and future expansion with the kind of warmth and fluency that made you want to believe every word. I watched people nodding. I watched Graham's team writing things down. I thought for one dark moment that she was going to pull it off. Then the questions narrowed. Graham started asking about the logic beneath specific systems. The staffing model. The vendor recovery protocol. The math under the shipping thresholds. The room was quiet and waiting. And Sloane answered every question beautifully and completely without meaning. She used the right vocabulary. She named the right systems. But when Graham pushed one layer deeper, when he asked why a specific decision had been made instead of a simpler alternative, she answered in ways that sounded polished but didn't hold weight. She said the team had worked through it together. She said the consultants had been very involved. She said these things with a smile that had worked in every room for 3 years. Graham didn't push back loudly. He simply kept asking. And each question made it more obvious that she was describing my work the way someone describes a painting they saw once, generally, confidently, from the outside. Then he leaned forward and said, before we continue, he needed clarity on who had actually built the operational framework the company ran on. Sloane laughed and said leadership was always collaborative and that some people in families confused helping with leading. She looked at me when she said it, with the same soft, practiced expression she had used at the party. The room was very still. Graham didn't look at her. He looked at me. He said to Ms. Bennett, "Would you walk us through it?" And I stood up. I had a file Dana had helped me prepare, but I didn't really need it. I opened it on the table in front of me out of habit, and then I just started talking. I walked them through the vendor structure from the beginning, why I had chosen a 3-tier backup system, what failure scenario each tier was designed to handle, how the activation logic had been written so nobody had to make a judgment call under pressure. I explained the staffing ratio model and the specific variables I had weighted when building it. I described the escalation map and the 3 incident types each pathway was designed for. Graham asked follow-up questions and I answered without pausing because I wasn't reciting something I had memorized. I was remembering work I had actually done. Elise, sitting 2 rows back, confirmed which systems I had trained department heads to use. 2 other senior managers spoke more honestly than I had ever heard them speak in a group setting, as if the shift in pressure had finally made it safe to tell the truth. Sloane tried to reframe it as teamwork. Then she cried. Then she called me vindictive. But the room had already changed temperature, and charm couldn't change it back. The acquisition didn't collapse. It was restructured. Graham's company did not buy Sloane's vision of what the company was. They bought the operational reality of what the company had been built to do. And those were 2 very different things. Sloane lost the narrative in that room and couldn't rebuild it afterward. The investors who had believed in her began asking sharper questions about governance and credit and structure. 2 of them reached out to Dana directly. The story Sloane had told for 3 years, the one where she was the visionary who had assembled a great team, started unraveling not because anyone attacked it loudly but because it couldn't survive detailed questions from people who cared more about operations than optics. My parents called after word got back to them. My father's voice was careful and a little smaller than I was used to. My mother asked how I was doing in a way that meant she had heard enough to know I hadn't been bitter. I had been right. I didn't slam the phone down on either of them. I just answered briefly and let the silence do the rest. There was no explosion. No revenge. Just the slow, irreversible settling of the truth into the places where a lie had been standing. Graham Hale offered me something separate. Not a rescue, not charity, something built. Leadership over a new operational division his company was launching, built specifically on the fulfillment and vendor systems I had designed. Full title, full authority, legal protections written into the contract so that nothing I built could be quietly reassigned to someone else's name. Dana reviewed every page. I signed it on a Tuesday morning in an office with tall windows and good light, with a cup of coffee at my elbow and nobody asking me to be invisible. The biggest thing wasn't the title. It wasn't the money, though that was real and it mattered. The biggest thing was smaller and harder to explain. It was walking into a room full of people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I had done. No asterisk. No backstory required. No sister standing at the front taking the credit while I stood at the back being grateful for being included. Just my name, spoken clearly, in a room where no one had any reason or ability to erase it. Avery Bennett built the company. I had known about it for 3 years. The difference was that now everybody else knew it too. And that, more than anything, was what I had been fighting for all along.